First of all, I want to start with a vignette from my own research, which has mainly been conducted in Highland, Ecuador. I've also done some research more recently on cider in Wales, but that's a whole different story. But in Highland, Ecuador, it was the health fair, stroke food festival. They were combined in Hima, the village where I conducted the majority of my fieldwork. And amongst the peasant women with whom I worked, who were tasked with setting up a number of pop-up stalls, there was some discussion about the rules which had been set by local political and community leaders about the foods that could and could not be sold at these stalls. Koi, roast guinea pig, which I've written a lot about, empanadas and humitas, which are steamed corn cakes, were very firmly in and allowed. Hamburgers and fries were completely and most definitely out. Chicha beer, which is a fermented maize beer, was in, and Pilsner lager was most certainly out. So when I asked about the reasoning behind these rules, I was told in no uncertain terms by both the women with whom I worked and political leaders that the foods that were allowed to be sold at the food festival were traditional foods. They were the foods from here, whereas those were excluded were the foods from outside or foreign foods, or in a local dialect, modern foods. And this dichotomy may seem initially very straightforward, but I'd like to unpack that a little bit, and these divisions between our food and their food, traditional food and new modern food, or food from here and food from there. Koi, roast guinea pig, absolutely indigenous creature to the Americas and to the Andes, but in the local area where I worked, it's served with rice, introduced by the Spanish conquistadores. Empanadas, made with white flour, again introduced by the Spanish. The exclusion of fries, made with potatoes, indigenous to the Andes, but just taking a slightly different form, and of course exported out then to Europe and the global north. So all of these foods then, whether they're contemporarily cast and framed as being from here or from there or traditional, are ultimately hybrids. They are both from here and from there. They are both traditional and they are both modern. And they are products of cultural interactions, exchanges of products, ideas, and ingredients and practices, and also of global trade or exploitation in the case of most of the Americas. And this was summed up by one of my teenage participants, who, when I asked him to define what traditional food was, or food from here was, he told me it's the food of our ancestors. But then he continued, and he went, but in a few hundred years' time, I'm going to be an ancestor, and I'm eating hamburgers. So therefore, hamburgers are going to be traditional food. Now, you cannot deny the logic, actually. I was like, fair point, well made. And this might seem a rather depressing thought, especially if we subscribe to a McDonaldization kind of view of the world, that cuisine is becoming increasingly homogenous, that cultural and culinary traditions are being eroded, that diversity is diminishing. But I'd quite often, and I sort of favour, I suppose, an alternative approach to that, which favours the kind of agency of individuals and communities. And if we scratch beneath the surface, we start to see innumerable creative appropriations of global foods at a local level. And the hamburger, which Caroline talked about earlier, is, I think, a very good example. We can think of how many multiple different forms a hamburger has taken. Now, there is evidence across the globe, and there are countless case studies, that food from here, foreign food, exogenous food, gets appropriated and gets incorporated to produce new hybrids and unique hybrids and new cuisines. And especially quite often it's those foods that are quite often seen as symbols or held up as symbols of homogenization. And then it's those very different very different social meanings are overlaid onto seemingly homogenous food or seemingly same food. McDonald's, for example, means something very different in China to what it does in the UK, to what it does in Ecuador. Different social meanings are overlaid onto these. So the global is made local and the homogeneous is made heterogeneous, and it gives rise to a whole range of diverse foods as communities and individuals creatively interact with new flavors, ingredients and culinary practices. Now, I'm not diminishing here the bigger political and economic questions about the structures of the food industry that enable a McDonald's to be in all places of the globe in order to enable this appropriation to take place in the first place. Though I think that's obviously a broader question. I'm interested in what's going on at a community level. So we see these creative practices emerging in dialogue with processes of globalization. And of course, with that is this accompanying desire to protect, quite often, the cultural heritage of foods due to the fear of cultural erosion, often as a process of this process of rediscovery, and food festivals are an example of that. So this commonly employs sort of top-down mechanisms such as UNESCO and intangible heritage, which we heard about earlier, in the case of Mushoku, GI, geographical indications, PGOs, etc. They'll attempt to wrap these very kind of protective arms around a particular foodstuff or cuisine and make it ours, quite often to the exclusion of, in the name of diversity, but quite often to the exclusion of others. So there's a danger here that foods and culinary practices are become timeless, they become reified, they become static, preserved in aspect, rather than the dynamic entities they are through these protective mechanisms. And hence the very creative practices that result in food diversity are paradoxically discouraged. Moreover, the protection of our food in the name of culinary and cultural heritage, or our food, can so readily slide into divisive discussions of authenticity, pureness, and of them and of us. And we've seen this played out, for instance, in contexts such as the hummus wars between Israel and Palestine, and also more recently around the Mediterranean diet. It can also, I think, there is evidence to suggest it can be sometimes rather alienating for smaller scale producers and consumers as those foods get celebrated as cultural heritage, as artisan, and become elevated to the extent that then they become appropriated and commodified. And certainly in the global south, or areas where I've worked, it is expected, those foods are then expected to be performed by certain segments of society. In the UK or in Europe, quite often we have this lovely idea of the artisan. It was great to hear. I was a cheesemonger in former life, so I love hearing about artisan cheese. But that's a very different model than a small-scale producer in a peasant, from a peasant background in Highland Ecuador, trying to be modern, trying not to be a peasant because it's socially disadvantageous to be so, and at the same time having various institutions or authorities, both political and economic, claiming their food and saying, we want you to carry on being this peasant and producing this lovely artisan food. So I think that's something to think about. So this, but saying this, food diversity, therefore, can be at times somewhat divisive. Food can obviously unite people, but I want to point out that it can also divide as it becomes a way of highlighting and reinforcing differences, as we've seen certainly in the case of a number of migrant groups. I've worked quite heavily at one stage at the horse meat scandal in the UK, which of course took place against the backdrop of a widening European Union, and that was very much played out. The discourse around that was very anti-East European because of the fears that were going on in the UK at the time about an influx of East European migrants. So these things are very strongly politically shaped, and it became kind of, they're the people that, especially in the UK, it's like, what's what the French eat. So it begs the question then, can culinary diversity sometimes be more harmful than good? Would we seem less different if we all ate the same food? So is culinary diversity then by default a positive? Should we always look to promote it? Or in the framing of this summit, is better food always diverse food? I'm kind of ignoring ecological and nutritional impacts here, just to kind of raise these questions about what is actually food diversity? How diverse does food have to be before we think about it as diverse? But to end on a kind of slightly more positive note, I suppose, the celebration of certain foods and cuisines and their association with particular groups and people and places can be incredibly positive, particularly amongst kind of migrant groups that I've worked with, as it encourages reflection quite often about culinary identities, can enhance the sense of value and encourage pride, and definitely, as we heard Rennie say talking earlier, it connects people to place and to gives senses of belonging and connects people to people, but also people to place. can also perhaps be a way of easing tensions and become a way of creating space and fostering cross-cultural dialogue, which is a project I'm working on at the moment, because of the way that food being this common mechanism that unites humanity, we might all eat different food, but we all still have to eat. We can then perhaps start to see and understand other people, and they may seem less alien and less other to us through their food. And there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that this even happens in moments of real conflict areas and areas where there is, I've seen evidence from this in the context of the Gulf War, for example, with American soldiers eating Iraqi food, and it made kind of the Iraqi people seem less demonized, particularly in a context where they were made to be created as demons by the US military. So it has significant power to cross cultural boundaries. But I also think there raises other questions about the extent that perhaps food offers this opportunity. There are lots of discussions at the moment, particularly around food and migration, about how food can be used practically to ease cross-cultural tensions. And I think this is still very much up for debate, because on one side, these kind of activities, these concerns, or there are concerns that it can lead to a cultural appropriation as the white cosmopolitan middle classes discover the latest ethnic food. And of course, this process of consumption enables them to create their own identity as cosmopolitan. But on the other, there is also this sense that it can empower individuals and minorities groups, both kind of economically, socially, and politically. And we're seeing, I think, certainly in the UK, I'm sure there are some in Denmark that because it's a new field for me, and I know that there's some in Canada as well, a number of community projects that are using food to help create or foster dialogue between different groups. And so far, whether that's things like cooking workshops or supper clubs or recipe books or culinary programs, that they're using food as a way of fostering cross-cultural understanding. And particularly, and it can be empowering, particularly as quite often these activities are orientated towards women, which creates a whole other debate about kind of women and their role as food workers and gender roles. But I'm working with an organisation called Soup, which is called Stories on Our Plate. We've just received funding via UK Research Council to explore these sorts of questions around supper clubs work fantastically well, and Soup has worked fantastically well, and there are similar activities in other parts of the UK when they're hosting supper clubs to, in London. But these are orientated towards, with people talking about, different groups talking about their food histories and their food stories as a way of promoting cross-cultural understanding. It works brilliantly when the audience is already white, middle class, cosmopolitan, slightly left-leaning and liberal. And therefore, it's a little bit maybe of preaching to the converted. The project that we just have, that we're just kicking off, is going, what happens with that model if we take it into very diverse but divided areas of the UK? In British terms, the Brexiteers. What happens? So we're going to places like Coventry and Bradford, such unique, exotic locations that I was not intending as an anthropologist to go to look at the ways in which food perhaps, so it's less about, can food kind of ease some of these tensions? Can it promote dialogue? Not to preach in a way of saying to those who are anti-refugees or migrants and asylum seekers coming into the community, not to kind of preach them and saying, you need to work with these people, live alongside these people, but just as a way of saying, can it create a space at an individual human level, cooking together, talking about each other's foods, taking away packets of each other's spices or ingredients, just so people start to engage on a more human level, as opposed to thinking about kind of the big political headlines, which of course we're seeing in an increasingly polarized context. So really, I just kind of want to leave it on that positive note that food can divide, diversity can divide, but for me that's why we should care about food diversity, is enables a way for which humankind can perhaps get over their differences. It can create differences, it can be used to symbolize differences, but it can also be a way that a mechanism to help smooth some of those tensions. Thank you.